The rolling hills around a medieval cathedral hid a secret as precise as any city street grid. By watching to the end, you will discover how monks and masons engineered entire landscapes with the same skill used to build walled towns. How did they align chapels with stars across miles? Why did they reshape rivers and hills? The answer lies in a forgotten blend of faith and geometry. The very places that feel organic and sacred today were laid out with surveying rods and astronomical calculations. The medieval mind never separated the sacred from the technical. Creating a ritual landscape demanded the same civil engineering expertise as erecting a new town. What other hidden designs might still lie beneath the ground we walk today? It was far more than a single church or shrine. In the medieval world, it meant an integrated network of sacred features spread across miles of countryside. Imagine a monastic precinct with its abbey and cloisters, then a winding pilgrimage path that led past wayside crosses, each one a marker for prayer. A holy well tucked into a grove, a boundary stone carved with a cross, a chapel perched on a hilltop, its altar aligned with the rising sun on a particular saint's day. All of these elements worked together like the parts of a clockwork mechanism. They were not placed randomly. They were designed to guide a person's movement step by step, to frame certain views at specific moments, and to choreograph the experience of liturgy outdoors as well as indoors. The very act of walking from one feature to the next became a form of worship, a physical journey that mirrored a spiritual one. Today we use the term ritual landscape to describe this, but the word is modern. The medieval planners never wrote it down. They simply understood it intuitively. They saw the land as a canvas for sacred storytelling, and they engineered it with the same precision they brought to building a cathedral spire or laying out a town square. So when you look at an old map or visit a historic village, ask yourself what invisible connections might link the church, the crossroads, and the spring down the lane. The landscape itself speaks if you know how to listen. The men who shaped these landscapes were far more than simple builders. They were scholars, engineers, and artists whose training rivaled that of any university graduate. The clergy who conceived the sacred networks often studied the 7 liberal arts, which included geometry and astronomy, alongside theology. Many abbots and bishops personally oversaw construction projects, reading Latin treatises on architecture passed down from the Roman world. Master masons, meanwhile, traveled across Europe, apprenticing for a decade or more before earning the right to design a church or a cloister. They carried with them not just hammers and chisels but detailed pattern books and geometric diagrams. Surveyors wielded instruments like the astrolabe and the quadrant, instruments that let them measure angles of the sun and stars to lay out alignments over long distances. Wealthy lay patrons, often nobles or merchants, also played a role, funding chapels and bridges as acts of devotion and prestige. Together, these individuals formed a network of knowledge. They drew directly from classical texts, such as Vitruvius' De Architectura, which described the principles of proportion and site selection. They also relied on centuries of empirical tradition, passed down through guilds and monasteries. So when you picture a medieval landscape, do not imagine rough peasants stumbling into place. Think instead of trained specialists consulting manuscripts under candlelight, then supervising teams of craftsmen on site for years. Their work blended faith with mathematics, intuition with precision, and the tools they mastered, geometry, astronomy, and hydraulics, were the very same disciplines that built cathedrals, fortified towns, and aqueducts. What they engineered outdoors was no accident. It was a product of deep learning, and the next steps will show just how they applied that knowledge to move earth and stone. Geometry was the hidden language of sacred landscapes. The medieval master masons and monastic planners did not guess where to place a chapel or how wide to make a cloister walk. They turned to a set of mathematical principles so powerful that they governed everything from the floor plan of a cathedral to the spacing of pilgrimage crosses across miles of countryside. The most famous of these principles is the golden ratio, a proportion found in nature and celebrated since antiquity. Roughly 1.618 to 1, it appears in the spiral of a seashell and the branching of a tree. The designers applied it to the dimensions of church naves and choir stalls, believing such harmony reflected the order of creation itself. But the golden ratio was only one tool in their kit. Far more common were two geometric systems known as ad quadratum and ad triangulum. Ad quadratum means from the square. It uses a square as the starting shape, then adds diagonals to create a series of nested squares and circles. This system allowed a mason to determine the height of a pillar from the width of an aisle, or the length of a transept from the width of the nave, all by drawing simple lines on parchment. Ad triangulum works with equilateral triangles. Stacked point to base, they produce a grid of perfect 60-degree angles. The result was a repeating pattern that could be scaled up or down, ensuring that a small wayside shrine and a great abbey shared the same underlying harmony. The most extraordinary surviving example of this geometric planning is the St. Gall monastery plan, a diagram drawn around the year 820. This single parchment shows an entire monastic complex laid out like a blueprint. The church, the cloister, the dormitory, the guest house, even the vegetable gardens are arranged within a precise grid based on a unit called the foot. The proportions repeat everywhere. The cloister walk is a certain fraction of the church width. The distance from the altar to the eastern wall matches the diagonal of a square drawn from the nave. Nothing is arbitrary. The plan was never fully built as drawn, but it became a teaching tool and a model for countless real monasteries across Europe. The same geometry governed the ritual landscape beyond the walls. The spacing between stations along a processional route often followed a simple triangular or square pattern. The angles of sight lines to a distant chapel were calculated using the same triangles used in the cloister. The landscape itself became a three-dimensional diagram of faith, where every step a pilgrim took echoed a mathematical truth. So the next time you see a medieval church ruin or walk an ancient path, consider the invisible lines of geometry still traced across the land. They are as real as the stones, and they hold a story of human ingenuity that reaches across centuries. The summer solstice sunrise did not only mark the longest day, it dictated where a church would stand. Medieval builders oriented entire monastic complexes so that the first light of a saint's feast day streamed directly through the eastern windows and struck the altar. This was not symbolic guesswork. It came from careful observation of the sun's path across the sky, recorded in tables and diagrams that monks copied by hand for centuries. The technique required a simple tool called a gnomon, basically a vertical stick planted in level ground. By measuring the length and direction of its shadow at sunrise and sunset throughout the year, surveyors could map the sun's rising and setting points with remarkable accuracy. They marked these spots with stones, wooden posts, or carved notches in the earth. Then, on the morning of a chosen feast day, they would return to the site, plant sighting poles along the line of the rising sun, and extend that line over hills and valleys to pinpoint the altar alignment or the route of a processional path. For longer distances, they used astronomical tables that predicted the exact angle of sunrise for any given day and latitude. These tables, often derived from ancient Greek and Islamic sources, gave them numbers that translated into degrees measured with an astrolabe. With this portable brass instrument, they could determine the elevation of the sun or a star above the horizon. On site, A master mason would stand at the proposed location of the high altar, line up the astrolabe with a distant marker, and calculate whether the rising sun on St. John's feast day would indeed bisect the nave. The process was repeated for every chapel, every gate, every cross set along a pilgrimage walk. Uneven terrain posed a challenge, but they solved it by building temporary towers of wood or using signal fires at night to keep a star aligned. They were not afraid of moving earth either. Sometimes they cut through a ridge or raised a platform to force the view exactly where the math demanded. The result was a landscape where the sun and stars became part of the architecture. If you stand in a medieval cathedral at dawn on the summer solstice, you might see a shaft of light creep across the floor, slow as honey, until it touches a carved stone marker. That moment was planned hundreds of years ago, calculated with precision we rarely expect from the medieval world, and the same kind of thinking shaped the paths outside the church, turning an entire valley into a sundial. Water flowed through medieval landscapes with the same precision as sunlight. The same minds that calculated solstice alignments also engineered springs, streams, and drainage channels to serve both the body and the spirit. Clean water was essential for drinking, cooking, and washing, but in a ritual landscape it carried a deeper meaning. Water purified. It washed away sin in baptism. It refreshed pilgrims after a long journey, and it symbolized the grace of God flowing into the world. So medieval planners did not simply accept whatever water source nature provided. They redirected, enclosed, and shaped it with stone and mortar, creating holy wells that were as carefully designed as any chapel. A typical holy well began with a natural spring. The builders would dig out the source, line it with carefully fitted stones, and often roof it with a small vaulted chamber. They cut channels to direct the flow into a basin or a trough, sometimes adding steps for easy access. The water emerged from the ground at a specific point, and that point was marked with a carved cross or an inscription. The grade of the channel had to be just right, steep enough to keep water moving but not so steep that it eroded the masonry. The masons used the same geometric principles to lay out these channels that they used for the cloister drains. The water itself was seen as a gift, but the container was a work of human skill. Nowhere is this engineering more visible than at Fountains Abbey in Yorkshire. The Cistercian monks who built that monastery in the 12th century chose a valley with a river running through it. But the river was not left to its own course. The monks constructed an elaborate water supply system that included a leat, a man-made channel that diverted water from the river upstream. This leat ran for nearly a mile, carefully graded to maintain a steady flow. It fed the monastery's kitchens, its brewery, its washing rooms, and its latrines. Then the wastewater was collected in a separate drainage system and channeled away from the living quarters. The drains beneath the cloister were wide enough for a person to walk through, lined with stone, and sloped precisely so that waste never stagnated. The same water that flowed through the kitchen also turned a mill wheel. Nothing was wasted, and all of this was designed to support a community that lived by a strict rule of prayer and labor. The water system was not merely practical, it was part of the ritual. The monks washed their hands before meals, and the water for that came from a special basin built into the cloister wall. The water that fell as rain on the church roof was collected and directed into a cistern for the sacristy, where it was used to clean the sacred vessels. Even the drainage from the infirmary was carefully managed to prevent disease. The whole system reflected the Cistercian ideal of self-sufficiency and order, a physical expression of their spiritual discipline. Beyond the monastery, water also played a central role in the ritual of baptism. In the early medieval period, many churches had separate baptistry buildings with pools large enough for immersion. These pools were often fed by a natural spring or a carefully piped water supply. The water entered the pool at one end and exited at the other, ensuring it remained fresh. The pool was lined with lead or stone, and the bottom was graded so that the water depth was uniform. The priest would stand in the water, and the catechumens would be immersed 3 times, symbolizing the Trinity. The engineering of these pools required precise knowledge of hydraulics. The inflow had to match the outflow to keep the water level constant. The overflow channel had to be hidden so that the pool appeared still and sacred. And the water had to be warmed in colder climates, sometimes by passing it through a furnace before it reached the pool. All of this was done without any modern machinery, using only gravity and stonework. So when you visit a medieval church or monastery today, look down at the ground. Notice the worn stones near a doorway, the slight slope of a path, or a channel cut into the floor. You are seeing the marks of a system that moved water not just for survival but for meaning. Every drop was directed with intention, and the same hands that built the altar also built the drain. The same hands that sculpted water also reshaped the earth itself. Moving soil and stone on a massive scale was another skill medieval planners wielded with quiet confidence. They carved terraces into steep hillsides, leveled entire hilltops, raised artificial mounds, and dug wide moats, all to create a ceremonial stage that guided every step a pilgrim or worshipper took. These alterations were not random or merely decorative. They were functional supports for processions, vistas, and the symbolic meaning of the land itself. At Glastonbury Tor in Somerset, the approach to the sacred hill was not left to nature. Monastic builders cut and filled the slopes to create a series of terraces that spiral around the tor. These terraces are so regular that some researchers believe they formed a processional path, a winding way that forced pilgrims to climb slowly, shifting direction with each turn, their eyes drawn upward to the tower at the summit. The earth moving required to create those flat bands on such a steep gradient was enormous. Workers dug into the hillside on one side and used the spoil to build up the other, creating a stable walking surface that would not wash away in rain. Each terrace was deliberately graded so that water drained off the path, preventing mud and erosion. The effect was not only practical but psychological. The slow ascent, the changing views, the sense of rising above the surrounding plain, all of it prepared the visitor for the sacred encounter at the top. The tor itself became a giant ritual object, shaped by human labor to mirror the spiritual climb toward heaven. Across the English Channel, the Abbey of Mont Saint-Michel rose from a tidal island, but its iconic silhouette was far from natural. The original rocky outcrop was much more irregular. Monks and masons spent generations leveling the summit to create a flat platform large enough for the church and cloister. They quarried stone from the mount itself and used the rubble to fill crevices and build retaining walls. The result was a series of terraces stepping down the mountainside. The lower terraces supported guest houses, shops, and fortifications, while the upper terrace held the abbey church. Every terrace was connected by steep stairways, and each one offered a different view of the bay and the sweeping tides. The processional route from the main gate to the church climbed through these terraces, passing through gateways and under vaulted passages, each stage marked by a change in light and sound. The sound of the sea, the wind, and the footsteps of hundreds of pilgrims echoed differently on each level. The monks designed these terraces to be experienced, not just seen. They graded the slopes so that rainwater did not pool, and they built underground channels to carry away runoff. The engineering was invisible, but without it, the entire complex would have collapsed into the sea or become a muddy, dangerous climb. Beyond hillsides and islands, some places required raising the ground itself. Many monastic churches sat on artificial platforms, built by piling earth and rubble onto low-lying ground. At the Cluny Priory of Saint Martin des Champs in Paris, the builders leveled a marshy area by dumping thousands of cartloads of stone and gravel, then capping it with a thick layer of clay to create a stable foundation. The raised platform lifted the church above the surrounding floodplain, making it visible from miles away. That visibility was no accident. The height of the platform was calculated to align with the sightlines from the main road and from the water, so that travelers approaching from any direction would see the church long before they arrived. The mound itself became a symbol of spiritual elevation. Moat digging was another form of earth moving that served both defense and ritual. The moat around a monastic precinct was often more than a military barrier. At the Cistercian Abbey of Fountains in Burgundy, the moat was fed by a diverted stream and structured to create a still, reflective surface. The monks walked along its edge during their daily meditation, and the water mirrored the sky and the abbey walls, reinforcing the sense of enclosure and peace. The moat also drained the surrounding fields, preventing waterlogging and disease. It was a landscape engineering project that managed water, movement, and symbolism in one sweeping gesture. All this reshaping of the earth required careful planning and massive labor. Surveyors used sighting poles and stretched ropes to lay out terraces and platforms. They calculated the volume of earth to be moved, the angle of slopes for drainage, and the depth of foundations to prevent slippage. They worked with picks, shovels, wheelbarrows, and baskets, moving tons of material by hand over months or years. The result was a landscape that appeared organic, as if the hills and mounds had always been there, but every contour was intentional. When you walk such a site today, the ground beneath your feet is the work of human hands. The Way of St. James stretched for nearly 500 miles across mountains and plains, and every mile was planned. This famous pilgrimage route, known in Spanish as the Camino de Santiago, was not simply a well-worn path that happened to lead to a cathedral. It was a deliberately engineered corridor, as carefully laid out as any Roman road or city street. The planners behind it, a mix of clergy, local lords, and monastic orders, applied the same surveying techniques used to build cathedrals. They calculated distances between stopping points, placed marker crosses at precise intervals, and constructed bridges and paved sections to keep pilgrims moving safely. The entire route functioned like a spinal cord, linking dozens of smaller shrines and churches into one unified sacred landscape. The final destination, the Cathedral of Santiago de Compostela, was the heart, but the path itself was the artery. The spacing of hospice churches along the Camino reveals a deep understanding of human endurance. A typical pilgrim could walk about 15 to 20 miles in a day, depending on terrain and weather. The planners placed these hospices, often run by religious orders, at roughly that interval. Each hospice provided shelter, food, and basic medical care. They were not random inns. They were positioned at the edge of towns or at crossroads where the path naturally slowed. The buildings themselves were oriented so that the chapel inside faced east, just like a parish church, allowing pilgrims to pray before resting. The distance between two major stops, such as Roncesvalles and Pamplona, matches exactly the distance a fit person could cover in a full day of walking. This was not coincidence, it was logistics. The planners measured the route using ropes or pacing, then marked the ideal location for a refuge. They also considered water sources. Every hospice sat near a spring, a river, or a well, ensuring that pilgrims could drink and wash. In some cases, they dug new wells or diverted streams to the site, bringing the same water engineering used in monasteries out into the open countryside. Marker crosses were another element of this invisible urban plan. Along the Camino, stone crosses called cruceros stood at intervals, often around every mile or so. These crosses were more than religious symbols. They served as waypoints, helping pilgrims gauge their progress and stay on the correct path. Surveyors determined the placement by sighting from one cross to the next, ensuring that the line was straight over long distances. Where the path curved, they placed a cross at the turning point. In fog or rain, the crosses became lifelines. The crosses were often carved with simple images of the saint or scenes from the pilgrimage, reminding travelers why they had undertaken the journey. The spacing was not uniform. In flat, open country, the crosses might be farther apart. In hilly or wooded terrain, they appeared more frequently, acting as reassurance that the path was still true. This system of markers was a direct application of the same geometry used to lay out a cloister, only scaled up to cover hundreds of miles. Bridges were perhaps the most impressive feats of civil engineering on the Camino. Rivers like the Ebro and the Arga could swell with spring melt, turning into deadly barriers. Medieval builders responded with stone bridges that still stand today. The Puente la Reine, or Queen's Bridge, is a stunning example. Built in the 11th century, it features 7 arches that carry the road high above the water. The arches are shaped as pointed arches, a design that distributes weight more efficiently than a round arch. The bridge deck is slightly convex, so rainwater drains off the sides. The builders selected a location where the river was wide and shallow, reducing the force of the current on the piers. They drove wooden piles into the riverbed, then built stonework around them, a technique that required precise measurement of water depth and flow. The approach roads were graded to meet the bridge at a gentle slope, so even a tired pilgrim could walk across without a steep climb. Similar bridges appear at regular intervals, each one a signature of the same careful planning. Paved sections of the Camino also demonstrate deliberate engineering. In many places, the original path was unpaved dirt, but near towns and in wet valleys, the surface was cobbled. The stones were laid on a bed of sand and gravel with a slight crown to shed water. This prevented the path from turning into a muddy trench during rain. The width of the paved section was standardized at about 6 to 8 feet, enough for 2 people to walk side by side or for a donkey to pass. In mountain passes, the path was often cut into the hillside, creating a shelf with a retaining wall on the downhill side. The wall was built with a slight inward tilt or batter so that the weight of the earth above pushed it tighter. This technique appears at the pass of Roncesvalles, where the path climbs steeply through the Pyrenees. The stones show centuries of wear, but the basic structure remains solid. Finally, the alignment of the entire Camino toward Santiago de Compostela was no accident. The route does not simply wander toward the coast. It bends and curves to pass through major pilgrimage churches, such as the Basilica at Santo Domingo de la Calzada, and to follow ancient Roman roads where they still served. But the final approach, the last 100 miles, is remarkably straight. Surveyors used sight lines and astronomical references to keep the path pointing directly toward the cathedral. On clear days, pilgrims could see the towers of the cathedral from miles away, a visual reward planned by the builders. The urban planning logic extended to the city of Santiago itself. The streets leading to the cathedral form a funnel, narrowing gradually so that the building appears suddenly, filling the view. This was a deliberate choreography of arrival, engineered to create a sense of awe. Every bridge, every cross, every hospice was a piece of a larger puzzle, and the completed picture was a ritual landscape that guided millions of travelers across a continent. The same logic that stitched together the Camino through stone bridges and marker crosses also wove a web of meaning across the English countryside. Consider the landscape around Glastonbury, a region soaked in lore but shaped by deliberate hands. Here, a network of churches, chapels, and hermitages was placed so that each foundation stood in clear sight of the next, creating a visual chain that pulled a pilgrim from one sacred point to the next. The planners understood that a distant spire or a hilltop tower acted like a beacon, drawing the eye and the feet forward. On the summit of Glastonbury Tor, a late medieval tower still rises above the plain. From that height, a traveler could see the low mound of Wiriol Hill, the site where legend says a certain holy man first set foot. The line of sight between the Tor and Wiriol Hill was not accidental. Surveyors had calculated the angle so that a person standing at one location could easily make out the other, even in hazy weather. This allowed a processional route to unfold naturally, with each landmark announcing the next long before the pilgrim arrived. The nearby Chalice Well, a spring enclosed in stone, was another node in this chain. Its position was chosen so that the water flowed from a point visible from both the Tor and the abbey grounds below. The path that connected these sites was not a straight line, but a winding curve that kept each destination in view for as long as possible. At the abbey itself, the great church was oriented so that the eastern window framed the rising sun on the feast day of a local saint, but also so that the tower could be seen from the approach roads miles away. This layering of sightlines meant that a traveler entering the region from any direction would always have a holy landmark in view. The result was a landscape that felt both guided and inevitable, as if the land itself was leading the pilgrim onward. The same principle appeared in the East Anglian Fens, a flat, watery region where the horizon stretched for miles. Here, the builders of medieval churches and chapels used the open terrain to create a grid of visible markers. The tall towers of parish churches like those at Boston and Ely served as beacons visible across the marshes. Smaller chapels were placed on slight rises, called islands, so that their roofs broke the flat line of the horizon. A boatman or a walker moving through the fens could navigate by these towers, knowing that each one marked a community and a place of worship. The distance between these towers was often a day's walk or a short boat ride, and the line of sight was deliberately maintained by cutting down any intervening trees or raising the ground level around the chapel. This was not mere convenience, it was a statement of ecclesiastical authority. The church was always visible, always present, watching over the landscape and its people. At Glastonbury, the hermitages scattered on the surrounding hills were placed in similar sight lines. A hermit living on a remote hilltop could see the abbey tower, and the abbey monks could see the hermit's cell as a tiny cross on the skyline. This visual bond reinforced the idea of a single spiritual community spread across the land. The hermit was not isolated. He was part of a network, and his presence was marked by the same geometric precision that aligned the abbey's altar. When a pilgrim walked from one hermitage to the next, the path was not random. It followed ridge lines and ancient tracks that had been surveyed to keep the next destination in view. The journey became a series of revealed vistas, each one a small reward for the effort of climbing the hill. This encoding of meaning into the landscape was not limited to sight. Sound also played a role. The bells of one church could be heard at the next, so that a traveler moving through the region would hear the call to prayer echoing across the valleys. The placement of bells was calculated so that the sound carried over the fields and marshes, marking the boundaries of the parish and the presence of the sacred. In the fens, where fog often obscured sight, the bells became the primary guide, ringing at intervals that led the lost toward shelter. What makes these networks so remarkable is that they were not the work of a single master plan drawn up in a royal court. They grew over decades, even centuries, as each new foundation was added with the existing ones in mind. The abbots and bishops who commissioned these churches and chapels consulted with masons and surveyors who carried the same geometric knowledge that built the great cathedrals. They used the same tools, the same ropes and angles, to place a small fenland chapel just as carefully as they placed a city church. The result was a region that functioned like a cathedral without walls, where the entire landscape became a sacred enclosure. And when you stand on the Tor at Glastonbury today, you can still trace those sightlines, following the ancient pattern with your eyes, wondering what other hidden connections still wait to be rediscovered. The choreography of movement inside a great abbey was as carefully timed as any theater performance. Every step a worshipper took, every turn they made, and every pause they held was guided by the same precision that aligned the sun with the altar. Processional routes were not simple hallways to walk down. They were sequences of controlled revelation, where the view was blocked and then opened, where the sound of footsteps echoed differently at each station, and where the meaning of the journey unfolded in stages. The planners treated the interior of the church and cloister like a series of rooms, each one a frame for a specific image or a particular prayer. The high altar, for example, was often hidden from the nave by a stone screen called a rood screen. This screen was not just a barrier, it had a central doorway, usually narrow, that forced the procession to file through single file. On the far side, the space suddenly widened into the choir, and the altar blazed with candlelight. The moment of stepping through that doorway was engineered to create a sharp contrast between the dim, confined passage and the luminous, open sanctuary. The same principle governed the placement of side chapels. A chapel dedicated to a saint might be tucked behind a pillar, invisible from the main aisle until the worshipper turned a corner. The turn itself was planned so that the first glimpse of the chapel window coincided with the recitation of a specific psalm. The timing was everything. The procession moved at a walking pace about 3 miles per hour, and the chanters adjusted their speed to match the distance between stations. The stations themselves were marked by carved wooden stalls, iron grills, or stone markers set into the floor. At each station, the procession would stop, turn to face a particular direction, and sing or pray. The length of the stop was calculated to allow the latecomers to catch up and to let the sunlight shift through a clerestory window, illuminating a fresco or a crucifix at just the right moment. Gateways and porticos served as thresholds between sacred and profane space. The main door of a cathedral was often recessed under a deep porch. This porch acted as a waiting room, a place where worshippers assembled before the procession began. The door itself was framed by carved tympanums showing scenes of judgment or salvation, meant to be studied during the pause. Once the door swung open, the interior was still hidden by a second door or a curtain. The procession had to pass through a small narthex, a narrow corridor that muffled sound and dimmed light, before emerging into the nave. The effect was a gradual transition, a peeling away of the outside world. Temporary structures amplified this control. On major feast days, carpenters would erect wooden scaffoldings outside the church, draped with cloth and hung with lanterns. These temporary porticos extended the processional route into the open air, guiding the faithful along a predetermined path through the churchyard. The scaffolding was designed to be quickly assembled and disassembled, but its geometry was as precise as the stonework inside. The posts were spaced to match the intervals of the nave columns, creating a visual echo. The cloth drapes blocked distracting views of the surrounding houses and fields, focusing attention on the immediate passage. At certain points along the route, a curtain would be drawn back to reveal a reliquary or a statue that had been hidden until that moment. The planners knew exactly where to place these reveals so that the sun struck the object at the optimal angle. The timing of the unveiling was synchronized with the chant, so that the moment of revelation coincided with the climax of a hymn. This was engineering of the highest order, but it was invisible to the participants. They experienced only the unfolding mystery, the sense that the sacred was being gradually disclosed. The routes also considered the movement of light throughout the day. A morning procession through the cloister would follow the east walk, where the rising sun cast long shadows and lit the carvings on the capitals. An afternoon procession would take the west walk, where the low sun streamed through the arcades. The planners oriented the cloister walks so that the procession always had the best possible light on the wall paintings and inscriptions. The same logic applied to the choir stalls. The monks sat in 2 rows facing each other, and the processional path ran down the center. The stalls were raked slightly upward so that each monk could see over the heads of those in front. The path itself was straight, but the turns at each end of the choir were tight, forcing the procession to slow and bunch together before spreading out again. The tight turns also aligned the monks with the side altars, so that each rank faced a specific image as they turned. Every inch of movement was considered. The result was a built environment that felt alive, responsive to the human body and the passage of time. The same hands that laid out the terraces of the Tour and the bridges of the Camino also choreographed these interior journeys. And if you ever walk into a medieval cathedral with this knowledge, you will feel the space differently. You will notice how the width of a doorway dictates your pace, how a sudden shaft of light pulls your gaze, and how a turn reveals a new world. The builders hid nothing, they simply orchestrated everything. The great monastic precincts of the Middle Ages were self-contained cities, just as carefully planned as any walled town. Take the blueprint drawn at St. Gall around the year 820. This single parchment shows a complex where every building had its assigned quarter, laid out with a clarity that modern zoning maps would envy. At the center stood the church, the spiritual heart of the community. To the south lay the cloister, a covered walkway surrounding an open garden. This was the monks' living room, their library, their classroom, and their place for quiet meditation. Beyond the cloister, the plan separated the functions of daily life with surgical precision. The kitchen, the bakery, and the brewery stood together on one side, close to the refectory where the monks ate their meals in silence. The dormitory sat above the warming room, connected directly to the church by a night stair, so the monks could descend for the midnight office without stepping outside. On the opposite side of the precinct, the infirmary offered a quiet retreat for the sick and the elderly, complete with its own chapel and garden. The guest house stood near the main gate, keeping visitors separate from the monks' private quarters. The novitiate, where new members trained, had its own cloister and workspace. There was even a school for boys, placed at the edge of the precinct, close enough for supervision but far enough to keep noise away from the church. This was not random arrangement. It was deliberate urban planning, a zoning of sacred and practical life that mirrored the layout of any medieval city, where guilds clustered by trade, markets occupied central squares, and walls separated the orderly interior from the chaotic outside world. The same thinking applied at Cluny in Burgundy, a monastery that grew so vast it became a city in its own right. At its peak, Cluny housed hundreds of monks and supported a population of artisans, servants, and laborers who lived within its walls. The church itself was the largest in Christendom until the rebuilding of St. Peter's in Rome, stretching nearly 600 feet from door to apse. Around it, the precinct contained a massive cloister, dormitories that could sleep 300 men, a refectory with vaulted ceilings, kitchens with hearths large enough to roast whole oxen, workshops for metalworking, leatherworking, and carpentry, stables for horses, granaries for grain, and a hospital that welcomed pilgrims and paupers alike. The circulation of water through Cluny was as sophisticated as anything in a Roman city. Pipes carried fresh water from springs on the hillside into the kitchens and the washrooms. Underground drains carried waste away from the living quarters and out beyond the precinct walls. The design ensured that drinking water never crossed paths with sewage, a principle of sanitation that would not become standard in many European towns for centuries. The same water system also flushed the latrines, which were built as a separate block connected to the dormitory by a covered passage. The monks did not have to walk outside in bad weather. The planners had thought of everything. Defensive walls enclosed this entire world. At Cluny, a stone wall with gatehouses ringed the precinct, separating the sacred city from the surrounding farmland and villages. The wall was not just for protection against attack, though that mattered in a turbulent age. It was a boundary that marked a different kind of space. Inside, the rhythm of bells governed every hour. Outside, the ordinary world followed the sun and the seasons. The wall made the distinction physical. The gate was the only point of contact, and it was controlled by a porter who decided who entered and who was turned away. This was exactly how a walled city operated, with gates locked at night and guards watching for strangers, but the monastery wall enclosed not just a population but a complete way of life. The central cloister served as the public square of this miniature city. In a medieval town, the market square was where people gathered to exchange news, conduct business, and see one another. In the monastery, the cloister filled that role. The monks walked its four covered alleys for daily meditation, reading from small books as they paced. They met there after meals for conversations which were permitted only in certain areas. They gathered there for processions on feast days, moving in a circuit that traced the shape of the square itself. The cloister garden, often planted with a single tree or a fountain at its center, provided a focal point for the eye and a symbol of paradise, an ordered garden at the heart of an ordered life. The architecture reinforced this civic function. The cloister arcades were open to the garden, allowing light and air to circulate. The columns were carved with scenes from scripture or with decorative patterns that monks studied as they walked. The benches built into the walls offered places to sit and read. The whole space was designed for movement and encounter, just like a town square, but enclosed and controlled, every element pointing back to the spiritual purpose that gave the city its meaning. The monks were the citizens of this sacred city, and their lives followed a constitution as strict as any municipal charter. They rose before dawn, prayed together 7 times a day, worked in the fields or the workshops, ate simple meals in silence while listening to a reading, and retired at sunset. The architecture supported every part of this routine. The church was oriented so that dawn light struck the altar at the first office. The refectory was heated by a single fireplace placed so that the warmth spread evenly down the length of the hall. The dormitory was ventilated by windows set high in the walls, letting out the heat of sleeping bodies. The chapter house, where the monks met each morning to hear a chapter of the rule and discuss community business, was positioned at the eastern side of the cloister, just a few steps from the church. Every building stood in relation to every other, and the distances were calculated so that a monk could move from dormitory to church to chapter house to refectory without wasted steps. The precinct was a machine for living, and the cogs were human bodies moving through spaces designed with urban precision. What made this comparison to a city more than a metaphor was the fact that many monasteries actually generated urban growth around their gates. The concentration of wealth, learning, and trade attracted merchants, craftsmen, and pilgrims who settled outside the walls. Villages grew into towns and towns into cities, all because the monastery acted as an economic engine. The precinct itself remained separate, a planned core surrounded by the organic sprawl of medieval life. The monastery was the original planned community, a sacred city in miniature that taught the surrounding world how to organize space, manage resources, and build for the long term. And when you walk through the ruins of Cluny today or study the parchment of St. Gall, you are looking at a vision of order that shaped not just the monks who lived within those walls, but the entire landscape of medieval Europe. The parchment plans were useless without the right tools to bring them to life. The master masons and monastic surveyors carried a kit of instruments that looked simple but demanded years of training to use with accuracy. At the heart of their toolkit was the astrolabe, a brass disc engraved with scales and fitted with a rotating arm called the alidade. This single object allowed them to measure the height of the sun above the horizon or the angle of a star at night. To lay out an alignment across a valley, the surveyor would set the astrolabe on a level stone or a tripod, sight along the alidade at the rising sun on a chosen feast day, and read the angle from the engraved rim. He would then mark that angle on the ground with a stake. Over the next weeks, he would return at the same time of day, adjusting the stake until the sight line matched perfectly. The sun itself became a fixed reference point, and the astrolabe translated its movements into measurable degrees. For measuring distances over long, uneven ground, they relied on the traversing rod. This was a long wooden pole, often 10 or 12 feet long, marked with notches at regular intervals. A team of 2 men would lay the rod end over end across the terrain, counting the number of times it was placed. For rougher ground, they used a knotted rope with knots tied exactly 1 rod apart. The rope could be stretched across slopes or around obstacles, and the surveyor would record the total number of rod lengths. To ensure the rope did not stretch or shrink with damp weather, they used hemp cord that had been soaked in linseed oil and dried, making it water-resistant. A standard rod was sometimes called a perch, and in many regions it measured about 16.5 feet, though local variations abounded. The surveyors carried a level, a simple device consisting of a straight wooden beam with a string and a plumb bob hanging from its center. When the beam was placed on the ground or on 2 stones, the string would hang exactly vertical if the beam was level. By adjusting the beam with wedges until the string aligned with a mark carved into the beam, they could find a true horizontal line. This was essential for grading water channels and laying foundations. To transfer a level line over a long distance, they used a water level, a long trough filled with water with a cork floating at each end. The 2 cork positions indicated the same height above sea level. They would sight across the tops of the corks with a straight edge, then mark the corresponding height on a distant post. The same principle was used to lay out terraces on steep hillsides, ensuring that each step was perfectly horizontal. The plumb bob alone was a vertical reference, a weighted cone of lead or iron suspended on a string. It was used to check that walls rose straight, that columns were perfectly upright, and that the axis of a church pointed exactly along the planned alignment. A single plumb line could reveal errors of less than a finger width over a height of 50 feet. To transfer a geometric design from parchment to the ground, the surveyors used a method called triangulation. They would select 2 fixed points, often an existing church tower and a prominent hilltop, and measure the distance between them using ropes. Then, from each of those 2 points, they would sight a third point using a simple sighting stick, a long staff with a vertical slit at one end and a crosshair at the other. By recording the angle between the 2 known points and the third point, they could calculate the third point's position using similar triangles. This allowed them to place a new chapel or market cross exactly where the parchment diagram showed, even if the ground was forested or hilly. They did not need to see the entire line continuously, only the 2 reference points and the new one. The church towers themselves became permanent survey markers. On a clear day, a mason on a scaffold could sight the tower of a neighboring abbey and align his stonework accordingly. The same line might be used to lay out the axis of a cloister or the direction of a processional walk. Over time, a web of such sight lines covered the countryside, each one a thread in the invisible grid that stitched sacred landscapes together. The precision was remarkable. Using only ropes and sighting sticks, they could lay out a straight line over a mile with an error of less than a few inches. They did this without a single compass reading, without a theodolite, and without any modern instrument. The tools were simple, but the knowledge of how to use them was a craft passed down through generations, and it turned the land itself into a parchment upon which they inscribed their visions of order. The cathedral tower was the highest point in any region, visible from miles away. That height was no accident. The builders chose the site not just for its symbolic elevation, but for its practical dominance over the surrounding landscape. From that tower, a surveyor could sight a distant chapel or a crossroads, and a pilgrim approaching from any direction could fix their eyes on the spire and know they were on the right path. The cathedral was the central transit hub of the entire ritual landscape, the place where all the invisible lines of geometry and all the visible threads of roads, paths, and processions converged. Its portal was more than a door. It was a designed gathering space, a deep porch carved with scenes that told the story of salvation. Here, worshippers assembled before entering the building. They waited in the shelter of the vaulted canopy, listening to the murmur of the crowd, feeling the cool stone against their backs. The portal faced the main approach road, so that the first thing a traveler saw was this gateway, framed by columns and topped with a tympanum. The space in front of the portal was not a random open area. It was a square, a forecourt, laid out with the same precision as the cloister. The stones of the square were often set in a pattern that guided the procession toward the door, creating a funnel that slowed the pace and focused attention. The edges of the square were marked by stone benches where people could sit and rest, or by low walls that defined the boundary between the sacred precinct and the ordinary street. Radiating from this hub, roads and processional routes spread outward like spokes of a wheel. One road led to the market cross, another followed the line of a former Roman highway toward the next parish church. A third wound through the fields to a holy well where pilgrims would stop to drink and pray before continuing. The cathedral's tower served as the navigational anchor for all of these paths. When a traveler lost their way, they looked for the tower. When a surveyor planned a new chapel, he lined it up with the tower. The entire region was organized around this single point, and the cathedral was the engine that drove the movement of people, goods, and ideas. Inside, the building was a microcosm of the landscape outside. The nave, the choir, the transepts, and the side chapels formed a network of spaces designed for ceremony and circulation. The flow of a processional route through the interior echoed the flow of pilgrims along the roads outside. The high altar stood at the focal point, just as the cathedral itself stood at the center of the geographical web. And when the bells rang out across the fields, they were not just a call to prayer. They were a signal that the hub was active, that the sacred machine was turning, and that the entire landscape was once again aligned with the rhythm of the liturgy. At Fountains Abbey, the monks turned a valley into a hydraulic machine. Before they laid a single stone of the church, they studied the river Gall as it tumbled through the wooded ravine. The water was not just a convenience, it was the lifeline of the entire community, and they engineered it with a precision that matched the finest Roman aqueducts. The monks diverted a portion of the river upstream through a man-made channel called a leat. This leat ran for nearly a mile, cut into the hillside and lined with stone, its gradient calculated so carefully that the water flowed at a steady, unchanging speed. Too steep and the current would erode the banks, too shallow and the water would stagnate. The masons used a water level to maintain the perfect slope, a fraction of an inch of drop for every 10 feet of length. The leat fed a series of underground conduits, stone-lined tunnels wide enough for a person to crawl through, that carried water directly into the abbey kitchens, the brewery, the washhouse, and the latrines. Each branch was fitted with a sluice gate, a simple wooden panel that could be raised or lowered to control the flow. The monks knew exactly how much water each area needed. The kitchen required a steady stream for washing pots and preparing food. The brewery needed a larger volume for cooling the mash. The latrines needed a fast, continuous flow to carry waste away. The system delivered exactly that, with no over-engineering and no waste. The water then collected in a drainage channel that ran beneath the cloister floor, its stone walls coated in a waterproof layer of lime mortar. This channel was not straight. It curved gently, following the natural contour of the valley, so that the water never backed up. The floor of the channel was sloped at a consistent angle, calculated by the same geometric principles used to align the altar. At the lower end of the precinct, the water emerged into an artificial lake. This lake was not a natural feature. The monks had dammed a smaller tributary with a stone wall, creating a reservoir that held thousands of gallons. The lake served multiple purposes. It provided a source of water for the mills that ground the abbey's grain. It stocked fish for the monks' meals, and it acted as a settling pond, allowing any silt or debris from the drainage system to sink to the bottom before the water rejoined the river. The overflow from the lake was carefully controlled by a stone weir that spilled excess water in a thin sheet, creating a constant, calming sound that drifted up to the cloister. The entire system was a closed loop, as ordered and self-sustaining as the monks' own daily routine. But the engineers behind it had not forgotten the symbolic meaning of running water. In the chapter house, a small basin was built into the wall, fed by a dedicated pipe from the leat. This basin was used for the ritual washing of hands before meals. The water flowed continuously, splashing into a stone bowl and then draining away through a hidden outlet. The monks saw this running water as a reminder of purification, a physical echo of the cleansing of sin. The same water that had been measured and graded by ropes and levels became a vessel for spiritual meaning, and when a visitor steps into the ruins of Fountains Abbey today, the water is still there. The leat still carries its steady flow, the lake still reflects the broken arches. The system never failed because it was built with the same care that built the abbey itself. The monks did not just build a church, they built a landscape that worked as perfectly as a clock, with water as its ticking heart. The same impulse that drove monks to engineer a valley into a hydraulic machine also moved builders to recreate an entire city on foreign soil. Across Europe, communities transformed hillsides and town squares into living replicas of Jerusalem. They measured distances from the Via Dolorosa, counted steps between the stations of the cross, and studied descriptions of the Temple Mount. Then they carved those dimensions into the local landscape, turning the geography of the Holy Land into something that could be walked without ever leaving home. The most ambitious of these projects rose in the Piedmont region of northern Italy. A series of 9 separate chapels, known as the Sacri Monti, or Sacred Mountains, were built on forested hillsides between the late 15th and early 17th centuries. Each chapel contained life-sized painted terracotta figures depicting scenes from the life of Christ. But the true art lay in the arrangement. The builders plotted the chapels along a winding path that climbed the hill, with each station placed at a distance calculated to match the traditional locations in Jerusalem. The distance from the chapel of the Last Supper to the chapel of the Agony in the garden was measured to echo the walk across the Kidron Valley. The climb from the chapel of the Flagellation to the summit mirrored the ascent to Golgotha. The planners used ropes and sighting sticks to lay out these distances, just as they would have for a monastery. They cut terraces into the slopes, built retaining walls, and planted trees to frame the view of each chapel exactly when the pilgrim turned a corner. The result was a pilgrimage experience that felt authentic, even though the trees were European oaks and the hills were the Alps. The same principle guided the creation of new Jerusalems in Prague and Bruges. In Prague, the Franciscan monastery of Our Lady of the Snows included a full-scale replica of the Holy Sepulchre. The builders measured the dimensions of the original tomb in Jerusalem and reproduced them in stone using plans brought back by travelers. The structure was a small domed chapel set in a courtyard surrounded by arcades. The distance from the monastery gate to the replica was paced out to match the distance from the city gate of Jerusalem to the tomb. Pilgrims who could not afford the journey to the Middle East could walk that same number of steps and receive the same indulgences. In Bruges, the Church of the Holy Blood housed a relic said to be a drop of Christ's blood, and the entire city was reorganized around this treasure. A processional route was laid out that passed through streets named after the stations of the cross, each turn corresponding to a specific event in the Passion narrative. The builders measured the length of the Via Dolorosa in Jerusalem and calculated the equivalent distance through the winding streets of Bruges. They placed small niches in the walls at each station, carving inscriptions and reliefs. The route ended at the Church of the Holy Blood, which itself was designed to echo the proportions of the cenacle, the room of the Last Supper, as described by medieval pilgrims. The topography of Bruges, flat and crossed by canals, was nothing like the hilly streets of Jerusalem, but the builders used the bridges over the canals to simulate the elevation changes. Each bridge became a symbolic hill, and the climb from one bridge to the next replicated the ascent toward Calvary. This was transcontinental engineering of sacred geography. The builders did not just copy a building, they copied a journey, a sequence of movements that held deep meaning for generations of believers. They used local materials, local stone and local soil, but the dimensions came from across the sea, carried in memory and on parchment. The hills of Piedmont and the canals of Bruges became vessels for a geography of faith, and the invisible lines that connected them stretched all the way to Jerusalem. A low stone wall, no taller than a person's waist, might seem like a modest barrier, yet in the medieval landscape, that wall marked a divide as absolute as any city gate. The churchyard boundary was not a casual fence. It was a surveyed line, measured with the same ropes and sighting sticks used to lay out a cathedral nave. Every yard of its course was deliberate, and the act of walking that boundary each year was both a legal necessity and a sacred ritual. The wall itself was built of local stone, often dry, laid without mortar, its top capped with a layer of turf or flat slabs to shed rain. At regular intervals, larger stones were set into the wall, carved with a cross or a simple groove, serving as permanent markers. The lich gate, the roofed entrance to the churchyard, was a threshold engineered for transition. Its name came from the Old English word for corpse, because here the funeral procession paused beneath the cover, the coffin resting on a stone slab while the priest said the first prayers. The lich gate was designed so that the living entered one way and the departed entered another. The passage from the world of the ordinary to the consecrated ground measured in a few steps under a wooden roof. Beyond the churchyard, the parish itself was defined by a network of boundary crosses. These were not the tall, elaborate market crosses found in town squares. They were simpler, often a single stone pillar set into the ground, carved with a cross on one face. They stood at crossroads at the edge of a field, or where a stream marked the limit of jurisdiction. Surveyors placed them at intervals that corresponded to a day's walk along the parish perimeter, so that a person could travel from one cross to the next and know they were still within sacred territory. The lines between these crosses were not imaginary. They were walked each year in a ceremony called beating the bounds. The parish priest, accompanied by the churchwardens and a crowd of boys, would process along the entire boundary, stopping at each cross or marker. At each stop, they would beat the marker with a wand or a stick, and the boys would be whipped or bumped against the stone, a harsh but memorable lesson in where the line ran. The ritual was a legal act, a public record of the parish boundary that could be testified in court, but it was also a spiritual act, a reaffirmation that the landscape itself was consecrated, that the space within the line was set apart. The thresholds were engineered for meaning. The main door of the church was often recessed, and the step up from the ground to the interior was deliberately tall, forcing a person to lift their foot and consciously cross over. That step was sometimes carved with a cross or a simple pattern, marking the moment of entry into sacred space. The same principle governed the gates of monastic precincts. The porter's lodge was built so that anyone entering had to pass through a narrow, dim corridor before emerging into the bright cloister. The change in light and sound signaled the transition, a small piece of architectural theater that prepared the mind for worship. The boundaries were not just lines on a map. They were engineered experiences designed to be felt in the body, remembered in the mind, and renewed each year by walking. And when a traveler crossed from the open fields into the shelter of a churchyard wall, they knew, without a word being spoken, that they had entered a different world, a world measured and marked by generations of careful hands. Every stone path and carved cross was a stage direction. The medieval landscape functioned as a vast open-air theater where the entire community became both audience and performer. The liturgy did not stay confined within church walls. It spilled out through the doors and unfolded across fields, hillsides, and town squares. The engineers of these ritual spaces designed specific stations where readings would be proclaimed, hymns sung, and scenes reenacted. An outdoor altar might stand on a raised platform at the edge of a grove, its stone surface oriented so that the presiding priest faced the rising sun, and the congregation gathered on a natural slope that formed a ready-made amphitheater. The acoustics of such a site were not left to chance. Builders positioned the altar against a rock face or a dense hedge that reflected sound back toward the listeners, or they dug a slight depression in the earth that concentrated the voice of the reader. The same logic governed the placement of a wayside cross where the gospel was read during a procession. The cross stood at a point where the path widened, creating a natural pause, and the ground was leveled so that the crowd could stand without straining to hear. The narrative sequence of a liturgical drama, such as the reenactment of Christ's entry into Jerusalem, required a route that imitated the original journey. The planners measured the distance from the city gate to the Temple Mount in the Holy City, then found a corresponding stretch of road outside their own town. They built a small chapel or a temporary scaffold at the endpoint, and they lined the path with spectators who waved branches, just as the crowds had done centuries before. The path itself was deliberately chosen for its visibility from a distance, so that the approaching figure of the priest playing Christ could be seen long before the first words were spoken. The landscape became a living scripture, and the engineers who shaped it understood that every bend in the road, every hollow that amplified a voice, and every hilltop that framed a view was a tool for telling a story. The community did not simply pray in their churches. They walked the stations, climbed the terraces, and crossed the thresholds, each movement following a script written in stone and earth. The ritual did not end when the last hymn faded. It lingered in the memory of the body, stored in the muscles that had climbed the same hill year after year, and the landscape itself, shaped for worship, became a silent witness to the drama that had unfolded upon it. The bell tower was not just a visual landmark. It was an acoustic instrument engineered to throw sound across miles of open country. The medieval masons understood that a bell's tone carried farther when the tower was open on all sides, with louvered slits that acted like directional speakers. They placed the bells high enough so the sound spread over the treetops, and they tuned the stonework of the tower itself to resonate at the same frequency as the bell's note. A single stroke could be heard in a neighboring village, calling the faithful to prayer or warning of danger. The tower became a voice for the entire landscape, and its message reached every ear within a carefully calculated radius. Inside the cloister, the same acoustic thinking applied to human voices. The monks chanted the daily offices in a space where every surface was deliberate. The arcades were lined with stone that reflected sound, but the open garden in the center absorbed it, preventing an overwhelming echo. The columns were spaced so that a single voice could be heard clearly at the far end, yet a chorus would blend into a seamless wave of sound. The vaulted walkways created a slight reverberation that gave the chant a floating quality, as if the music hung in the air before fading. This was not accidental. The builders knew that a certain proportion of height to width would produce a pleasing acoustic, and they calculated those dimensions using the same geometry that aligned the altar. Light was engineered with equal precision. Stained glass windows were not merely decorative, they were filters that controlled the quality of light entering the church. The colors were chosen so that at specific hours, a shaft of red or blue would strike a particular wall, carving, or altar. The thick stone walls held small apertures called squints, angled so that a narrow beam of sunlight would fall exactly on the altar at the moment of the consecration. The builders studied the path of the sun across the sky, marked the solstices and equinoxes, and cut the openings accordingly. The result was a daily performance of light and shadow that told a story of time and divinity. The congregation did not need to read the scriptures. They could watch the light move across the stone, and they understood that the world itself was ordered by a higher hand. Every bell, every chant, every beam of light was a designed element, woven into the fabric of the landscape as carefully as any wall or path. A medieval city and a monastery were cut from the same blueprint. The same master planners who laid out the straight streets of a new market town also surveyed the winding processional paths of a sacred hill. They carried identical tools, ropes, and sighting sticks, and they applied the same geometric principles to both projects. The distinction between a secular settlement and a ritual landscape was often invisible on paper. A city gate and a lich gate both served as thresholds, marking the transition from one world to another. The heavy oak doors of a town wall swung open at dawn and closed at dusk, just as the lich gate sheltered the entrance to the churchyard. Both were engineered for control, for the slow passage of people through a narrow opening, forcing them to pause and acknowledge the boundary. The market square at the heart of a borough was paved in a pattern that guided traders and shoppers toward the central cross or the town hall. That same pattern appeared in the atrium of a cathedral, where the stones were laid to funnel processions toward the main portal. In both cases, the open space was not empty. It was a stage framed by buildings and designed for gathering, for exchange, and for ceremony. Water systems followed identical logic. A city diverted a river into a network of conduits that fed public fountains, private houses, and the latrines of the guild hall. A monastery diverted the same river into a leat that fed the kitchen, the brewery, and the drainage channel beneath the cloister. Both systems relied on the same graded channels, the same sluice gates, the same careful calculation of flow. The engineers who built one were often the same people who built the other. Many master masons worked on both town walls and abbey churches. They brought their notebooks of proportions, their templates for arches, and their experience with hydraulics from one project to the next. A town like Bruges grew around a network of canals that were surveyed using the same triangulation techniques that aligned the chapels of the Holy Blood. The canals themselves became processional routes with bridges designed as stations. The market cross in the square echoed the wayside cross in the fields. The town hall and the cathedral shared the same geometric harmony, the same ratio of width to height, because the same minds conceived them. The distinction between sacred and secular was less about design and more about purpose. The tools and techniques were interchangeable. What changed was the meaning assigned to the lines drawn across the land. A street grid served commerce and defense. A processional path served worship and memory, but both were products of human ingenuity, shaped by the same need to order space, to guide movement, and to create a world that felt intentional. And when you walk through a medieval city today, you are walking through a landscape engineered with the same care as any monastery. The lines are just drawn for different reasons, but they are there, waiting to be read. Every stone in that landscape was hauled by human muscle. The vision of a sacred geometry drawn across the land could not exist without the raw physical effort of thousands of workers. Quarrying the stone itself began high on a hillside, where veins of limestone or sandstone were exposed by stripping away layers of turf and soil. Workers drove wooden wedges into natural cracks, then soaked them with water until the swelling split the rock. They levered blocks onto sledges and slid them down timber ramps to level ground. A single block for a church wall might weigh several tons, and moving it a mile could take a team of oxen an entire day. The roads they traveled on were often built for this purpose alone, rutted tracks hardened with gravel and lined with drainage ditches to keep them passable in rain. Forest clearing was another enormous task. Even where a hilltop was chosen for its prominence, the trees that blocked the sightlines had to be felled. their stumps grubbed out, and the land terraced to create a stable foundation. The timber itself was put to use as scaffolding, as fuel for the lime kilns that produced mortar, or as beams for the roofs of temporary shelters that housed the workers. The work crews were not a single unified force. They were layered like the society that supported them. At the top stood the master mason, the architect and engineer, who carried the geometric diagrams and directed the placement of every stone. Beneath him worked the journeyman masons, highly skilled men who traveled from project to project, carving capitals and cutting blocks to precise dimensions. Below them, the apprentices and laborers did the heavy lifting, mixing mortar, hauling water, and stacking rubble. In the fields around the site, a separate army of farmers and peasants contributed their labor as part of their feudal obligations, often for a set number of days each year. They dug the foundations, cleared the brush, and drove the wagons. The scale of this operation matched the building of any medieval city. A single monastic precinct might consume tens of thousands of tons of stone, thousands of oak trees, and hundreds of thousands of man-days over a decade or more. The funding came from many sources: local tithes, a tenth of every harvest paid for the daily bread of the workers. Wealthy nobles donated lands and rents, granting the monastery a steady income. Pilgrims left coins at shrines, and those small offerings added up over years. Bishops and kings granted indulgences, which encouraged further donations from the faithful. The entire economy of a region could revolve around a single construction project, with markets springing up to supply food, tools, and clothing to the workforce. The spiritual project was grounded in this gritty reality. The same hands that shaped the sacred landscape also blistered under the sun and ached from the cold. The same oxen that hauled the altar stone also pulled the plow. The lines of geometry were drawn on parchment by candlelight, but they were carved into the earth by sweat and stone dust. And when a pilgrim finally stood before the finished church, they saw not just a vision of heaven, but the labor of generations made visible in the solid weight of the walls. The same stone that took generations to raise was pulled down in a single lifetime by orders from distant capitals. The upheavals of the 16th century swept across Europe, and the ritual landscapes that had been engineered with such care suddenly became targets. Monasteries were dissolved, their lands confiscated, and their buildings stripped of lead, timber, and stone. The great hydraulic systems fell silent. The leats silted up, the bells were melted down for cannon. The processional paths that had been trodden for centuries grew over with grass and brambles, and the sight lines that once connected chapel to hilltop tower were broken by new walls and hedges. The people who had walked those routes no longer understood their meaning. The old feasts were abandoned or suppressed, and the sacred geography of the region faded from memory, becoming just another set of fields and ruins. Some features found new purposes. A former abbey's great hall became a barn for storing hay. Its cloister was turned into a cattle pen. The stone from the church was carted away to build houses and farm walls. The carefully surveyed boundary crosses were uprooted and used as gateposts or left to topple into the undergrowth. The holy wells, once centers of pilgrimage, were capped or forgotten, their water diverted to irrigate crops. The very geometry that had ordered the landscape was erased, not by malice but by the slow pressure of changing times. Yet not everything vanished, the earth remembered. Beneath the soil, foundations remained. The lines of the old water channels still showed as faint depressions in the ground. The sight lines, though broken, could be traced again by anyone who knew how to look. For centuries, these traces lay hidden, visible only to the most careful observer, like the ghost of a city beneath a modern field. Then, in the last few decades, a new kind of surveyor arrived, armed not with ropes and astrolabes, but with lasers and magnetism. A small aircraft flew low over the English countryside, its belly carrying a device that fired pulses of light at the ground. The pulses bounced back, and the instrument recorded the time of each return. From those millions of measurements, a computer built a digital model of the terrain, stripped of trees and buildings. The image revealed a landscape within the landscape, a pattern of ridges and hollows that the naked eye had never seen. This was LiDAR, and it opened a window onto the buried past. In the forests around Glastonbury, the laser scans showed the terraces of the Tor more clearly than ever, and they also picked out the faint traces of processional routes that had been erased from the surface. In the valleys of the monastic estates, the scans revealed the full network of leats and ponds, mapped out as precisely as the original builders had laid them. On the ground, geophysical surveys added another layer. A team walked slowly across a field, pulling a device called a magnetometer that measured tiny variations in the Earth's magnetic field. Where stone foundations lay just beneath the topsoil, the readings jumped. Where a buried channel held water, the signals shifted. The data built a picture of a vanished world, a stone skeleton beneath the grass. Historical maps, some dating back centuries, were overlaid on these digital surveys. The boundaries drawn by medieval scribes on parchment now matched the lines picked up by the magnetometer. The old field names, recorded in faded ink, spoke of chapels long gone and wells that had been filled in. The maps and the machines together told a story that had been waiting to be read. What had been dismantled above ground still survived below, and the modern tools were re-engineering the landscape in a different way, not by moving earth, but by revealing what had always been there. The same geometry that had guided the monks now guided the archaeologists, and the sight lines that were broken by the Reformation were being traced again, this time on a computer screen. The landscape had kept its secret for 400 years, and it was only now beginning to speak. But not every line on the medieval landscape carries a hidden message. Some researchers argue that many of the alignments we interpret as intentional are actually coincidences, the product of over-enthusiastic pattern seeking. The debate is a healthy one, and it keeps the entire field honest. A skeptic might point out that medieval builders often reused older Roman or even prehistoric sites, so any solar alignment at a particular church could be inherited from a much earlier structure, not a deliberate choice by the medieval mason. Others note that the geometry of ad quadratum and ad triangulum was a practical tool for laying out buildings, not a secret code. Those systems made construction faster and more efficient, ensuring that arches fit and walls stood straight. The mystical interpretations came later, from modern writers who saw meaning where the original builders saw only a good way to measure a right angle. The counterargument is just as compelling. Across Europe, the evidence of deliberate astronomical orientation is too consistent to be dismissed. Monastic chronicles occasionally mention aligning the church with the sunrise on a particular feast day. The same proportion appears in the width of a nave and the distance between two pilgrimage crosses in a valley. When a pattern repeats across hundreds of sites spread over centuries, chance becomes a very unlikely explanation. The truth probably lies somewhere in the middle. Many alignments were functional, necessary for drainage, for stability, or for the flow of a procession. But some were unquestionably symbolic, chosen to mark the liturgical calendar or to echo the heavens. The medieval mind did not draw a sharp line between the practical and the sacred. A well-graded drainage channel and a correctly oriented altar both served the same god. The debate is still unfolding as new measurements and new technologies test old assumptions. Each discovery adds another layer to our understanding, and the final chapter has not been written. The debate over intention does not diminish the final result. Whether every alignment was calculated or some were happy accidents, the landscape that emerged was a total work of art, a gesamt Kunstwerk before the term existed. The medieval builders did not separate engineering from aesthetics or function from faith. They designed environments that engaged the whole person, the eyes following a sight line, the ears catching a bell from miles away, the legs climbing a terraced hillside, and the mind reflecting on the story embedded in every turn. Water flowed not just to wash hands but to symbolize purification. Stone was not just quarried and stacked but carved into a narrative that could be read by a person who had never held a book. The processional route was not a path but a sentence with punctuation at every cross and chapel. This integration stands in stark contrast to the way we build today. Modern disciplines are siloed. An engineer designs the drainage, an architect shapes the building, a landscape architect arranges the grounds, and a lighting consultant plans the illumination. They often work in isolation, and the result can feel fragmented, lacking the coherence that comes from a single guiding vision. The medieval master mason, by contrast, held all those roles in his head. He understood how the sun would move across the ground, how the water would flow, how the sound of a chant would carry, and how a pilgrim would feel after climbing a particular slope. He built not just a church but an entire world that supported the life of the community and the rituals that gave that life meaning. Recognizing this engineering transforms how we see the Middle Ages. It is easy to dismiss that era as superstitious or crude, but the evidence of the landscape tells a different story. The people who shaped those hills and valleys were thinkers, planners, and problem solvers. They applied geometry to transform the natural world into a stage for belief, and they did it with tools that seem impossibly simple by today's standards. Their work was not naive, it was sophisticated, deliberate, and deeply human. And when you stand in a place like Glastonbury or walk the Camino, you are not just visiting a historical site. You are stepping into a work of art that was engineered to move you, body and soul, toward something greater than yourself. The landscape still holds that power if you know how to look. Every ridge, every channel, and every stone was placed with intention. The evidence across Europe now stands as a testament to a truth that is easy to overlook. The same hands that built cathedrals also carved hillsides. The same minds that calculated the height of a vault also measured the distance between pilgrimage crosses. The same faith that inspired prayer also demanded geometry. These ritual landscapes were not accidents of tradition. They were engineered environments, planned and built with the same care, the same tools, and the same expertise as the great medieval cities. The master masons and monastic surveyors did not separate the sacred from the practical. They fused them. They saw the land as a canvas for a story that needed to be walked, heard, and felt. And they used every resource available, from the sun and the stars to the flow of water and the weight of stone, to create that story. What this reveals about medieval societies is profound. They were not a dark age of superstition and crude labor. They were a civilization of sophisticated problem solvers who understood mathematics, astronomy, hydraulics, and human psychology. They could organize work on a massive scale, coordinate labor across decades, and transmit knowledge across generations without the aid of modern communication. Their achievements in engineering, both in stone and in landscape, rival those of any era. We still live within the shadow of their vision. The fields we walk, the paths we follow, and the ruins we admire all carry the marks of their planning. The next time you stand before an old church or trace a winding road through a valley, pause. Ask yourself what invisible lines might still be guiding your steps. The landscape is never just a backdrop. It is a deliberate design, and it is still speaking. If you enjoyed this journey into the hidden engineering of the medieval world, please like this video and subscribe to the channel for more stories of discovery buried beneath the surface. Share your own thoughts in the comments. Have you ever walked a path that felt planned? Let us know. And as always, thank you for watching.